The role of communities and grassroots movements, we tend to think as a spontaneous arising. You press a button and you have a movement. Or actually, that a movement just happens. But in fact, maybe it's something in between. And today, on episode number 107 of CXOTalk, I'm talking with Joe Trippi, who for a living actually creates movements. My glorious co-host, Vala Afshar, is, I don't know where he is. Vala's out there in the ether somewhere, and Vala, if you can hear this, send us a sign. Send us a sign. But in the meantime, Joe Trippi, how are you?
Good to be with you, Michael. How are you doing?
I am great, and I'm thrilled and honored that you're here for episode number 107 of CXOTalk.
Wow. 107, that's cool.
It's a lot of episodes.
Yeah, I didn't realize there'd been that many. I just started picking up on this a while ago, but it's great. I really enjoy it.
Well, you know, we've had people like David Bray, who I know who actually introduced me to you, and Craig Newmark, who I know you know. But Joe, tell us about your professional background, just to give us some context.
Well, I've always been one of these people who I was torn between what would change people's lives more, politics or technology. And so I didn't know which field to get into, and I kept going back and forth between the two. I was an aerospace engineering major in college, but somehow got involved in politics and and then would leave politics for a few years and go work in Silicon Valley with mostly e-commerce companies and cybersecurity and things like that, and then would go back do politics for 4 or 5 years. So I did presidential campaigns and other things. Anyway, by 2004, I had been dangerous enough in both worlds. I mean, I knew enough about politics and enough about the sort of technology and where things were going to think and see that maybe you could do politics in a different way, merge the two, and actually change the way we do campaigns. That turned out to be the Dean campaign, and I think if I'd just been in technology all that time, it wouldn't have worked. There are a lot of people in technology who don't understand politics, a bunch of people in politics who don't understand technology, and somehow like I said, I just sort of waited around in both those two worlds long enough to see that there was a way to do something different.
So you say do politics in a different way. And obviously this, as you're saying, was informed by technology and kind of the marrying of the two together. So tell us what you saw and what you did.
Well, the politics is a horrible, and a lot of corporate America is very top down. Most of our institutions are real top down. Orders come from the top, and people at the bottom are supposed to follow them. And I always had thought that politics should be the people tell the top what to do. And so what I realized in the late 90s was that the internet, the network technology, the devices that were on people's desks and now increasingly in their hands, were actually ways that people could join together and create the politics that they wanted, instead of getting served up the politics that the party or someone else was dictating. And so that kind of got me thinking about how to do it differently. And then Howard Dean came along and asked me to run his campaign, and I finally had the opportunity to try it out. I think probably a few years ahead of when the network was big enough, when there were not enough people on it. 4 years later, the Obama campaign, we were the Wright brothers compared to the Obama campaign. This was the Apollo project. They actually got a guy, launched him, and landed him safely in the White House. It's been clear to me for quite some time that the party structures, and I think this is happening in all kinds of corporate world too. The way things work are going to change and be very disruptive, and it's going to be a lot more decentralized and a lot more people coming together and creating the narrative.
So you talk about creating a narrative, and in terms of, well, why don't you tell us the story of the Dean campaign for those of us who don't know, because it's a pretty fascinating story, and then maybe we can talk about narratives and talk about storytelling.
Sure. Well, look, the Dean campaign, like a lot of campaigns, with both parties start off with the candidates that the establishment and the party perceives as the right guy to nominate, the right person to nominate, and they don't like an insurgency or someone who comes out of left field that they don't never heard of, or might disrupt their place in the hierarchy of the party. The Dean campaign, Howard Dean was an insurgent that no one at the top, no one in the party establishment wanted anywhere near being their nominee. And there were 3 or 4 candidates, John Kerry, Dick Gephardt, John Edwards, who all the big money and the movers and shakers were behind one of the 3 of them. And all of them thought the Dean campaign, or Howard Dean himself, was somebody didn't have a chance. They weren't going to waste any money on him. They certainly weren't going to help him, and they weren't going to risk the future of the party on someone like him, who wouldn't listen to them and had his own thoughts. So anyway, essentially, when he hired me, we had $92,000 in the bank, and exactly 481 people who supported him across the country, or even knew he was running. Doing a presidential campaign, you have to be able to raise, $92,000 won't even get you a couple of flights out to Iowa and, on the campaign trail. So we had to, by necessity, find a new way to do it. And that was to take that 430 or 81 people and use them. I mean, run a decentralized campaign, not top down, but decentralized around the country. Use those 481 people, ask them to build it from the bottom up, to talk to their friends, to tell them why they were supporting Howard Dean, and why it was important to get their friends, a coworker, or someone else out there. And of course, we had, to join us. And within a week or two, we had, again, because of the network, because of peer-to-peer, because of the ability for each of those people to tell their own story about why they were happy working for Howard Dean and why it was important for them that their friend join, we went from 481 to 1,000 people within a week. We went from 1,000 people to 10,000 people in about a month, and then we went to 159,000, and we grew to the 600,000 people, and it was all through the telling of the story. And the story was that it was a classic story of the little guy with all the odds against him, stacked against him, who wanted to stop the war in Iraq, and needed the people who felt that same way to join all of us together and form a movement to make him our voice and our nominee. And what happened was that, very simply, one of the things that happens when you're telling a story, I had read a book by James McGregor Burns on leadership right before the campaign, where he talked about, and I think this is really important, particularly in the corporate world today. There is something inchoate in every human being. It's sitting in there. They kind of know it's there. They know it's true, but they haven't heard anybody else say it. And when they hear someone else say it, so if you, using the war as an example, people knew they were against the war, but the country was 80% for the war, and the people that were against it at the time thought they were the only person, and they were all keeping their mouths shut, because in public company, if they went into a room at a dinner party or something, said they were against the war, 80% of the people, everybody, the 20% that were with them stayed silent, and the 80% that were for the war looked at them like they were crazy. So they really literally thought they were the only one. And by giving voice to that narrative, to that story, and saying, look, there's 481 of us, let's go find, there are a whole lot more out there, let's find them. Here's the safe place for you to come if you care about this issue as much as we do. Join the Dean campaign. It was this very simple narrative that woke everybody up. There was suddenly, the movement was out there. It existed already. What they didn't, they had no idea where to go, who else was, that there were other members or anything. And by sort of articulating what was already, what they all knew was true, but they didn't know it was true. It's a very hard thing to get around, to get your head around sometimes, that things that we know but are unaware that we know them can really trigger in people a sense of coming together and moving together. And that's what happened in the Dean campaign. By within 6 short months, we had this campaign that had no big donors or anything, had more money, had raised more money than Bill Clinton had raised when he ran, not the first time for president, but when he ran for as the sitting president for re-election in 1996. The Dean campaign surpassed that, that volume of people and money coming to us. So it was a pretty remarkable campaign. Again, also, by the way, at a completely different time. We didn't have, the iPhone wouldn't be released till 2007. YouTube didn't exist till after the campaign. We had created something called Dean TV, which was, in fact, YouTube. You could upload video, you could rate it, you could tell your friends to watch it. It had about 250,000 people, because there wasn't a whole lot of broadband even in 2000 yet, in 2004.
So then, it's what everybody wants today on social media is to have shares and likes and all of that. And it sounds that what you were doing with the Dean campaign was essentially kind of the essence of today, what people want to do through their social media, sharing their information through social media. But how can you identify those aspects of the shared consciousness or shared awareness or shared concern so that you can tap or touch the nerve that you obviously did with the Dean campaign?
Well, like I said, it's out there. People, take anything. People who own Priuses, for example, hybrids. There's a commonality to them, but why did they do that? It's really interesting. Old advertising always wanted to know why people do things. It wanted to know, do focus groups to see why they did what they did. With data now, what data does is, we're not so much interested in why people do things, but that they're doing it. Those people bought a Prius, they bought a hybrid. So now the question is, that's a community. And suddenly Toyota could start to build, I think, a community around that brand, around that vehicle, around the people who own it, in terms of, there's ways to, it doesn't have to be the war or global warming or an issue. It can be, obviously, in politics. But I think what's really important for brands to understand is their brand already has a lot of people committed in one way or another to the brand. Now it's a question of how do you form a community around the brand in a different way. I mean, you know, using the data. We didn't have a lot of data in the Dean campaign. We were doing it literally flying blind. But during the Dean campaign, we started to realize that, you know, we could quantify things, that we could see, you know, why are people, again, you didn't have to ask, why do people use the red button to donate more? It didn't matter why. What it mattered was when we were testing things, green, blue, or red, more people chose red and did it. So we knew you're able to use data to move things in the right direction, and also to carry on, not just that, but to carry out a narrative. One of the most important things about a narrative or story is that it lets, again, if you know something but aren't quite aware of it, data helps us get people to visualize and realize they are aware of it. I mean, to make them get it. My best example of that right now is if you know the book The Second Machine Age that came out last year or the year before that. They do an incredible job in like a few pages of getting you to understand that it's an old story of the inventor of chess being killed by the emperor who wanted to reward him for inventing chess. And the inventor puts a grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard and tells the emperor, you can reward me by just doubling that to 2 grains of rice on the next square, 4 grains of rice, 8 grains of rice, 16 grains of rice. And at the end of the 64 squares on my chessboard, I will walk away with food to feed myself and my family and many more people, and that's all I want. The emperor said yes, but see, 64 doublings is 15 quintillion grains of rice. It's a pile of rice higher than Mount Everest, and that 15 quintillion grains of rice is more rice than was produced worldwide in the year 2010.
Mm-hmm.
So the emperor realizes if he gives the guy his reward, he's going to be ruined. He'll give him his entire empire. So he does back then, in the year 600 AD, what every good emperor would do. He kills the inventor of chess. Now that I just use a whole bunch of data and facts to tell a story. But here's the aha moment. Computing, Moore's law, computing technology, the capacity of computing, cutting it in half. I mean, doubling in capacity, but reducing to half the size and half the cost every 2 years. Here's what's going on. And here's why that narrative I just told you is important. Because computing power has just reached the second half of the chessboard. So when you and I, now, you get, in other words, before I don't tell you the first part of that story, you don't get what I'm about to tell you. I'm about to tell you that the reason we're seeing such rapid change, the reason we're seeing such disruption is because it didn't matter when we went from a 256 machine to a 512 machine. It doubled, but what the hell, what did that do? You had a little bit more room on a floppy or something. In the next 2 years, the computing capacity that, if your lifetime, is going to double. Everything you've seen, all of it is going to double. It's going to cut in half the price. It's going to get to a smaller form factor. That's why all this massive change is going on. And we're going to get to 15 quintillion. In other words, if you understand, so I'm using the data narrative data-driven narrative. They did it very well, incredibly well in this book, The Second Machine Age, that all this is how you can get people to grasp things that there are a lot of people today who are aware of what I'm saying, but are not, they know it, but they're not aware of it. And the more of them become aware of it, then the more they're actually able to join a community that gets where we're going, what we have to do, meet challenges, et cetera. And that's the same within your company or in politics.
Okay, so the importance of using data to help people understand what? Understand the point of the story?
Right. Well, yeah, what I'm trying to, if I've got my company's got a message or a concept that I'm trying to get you to get, it's using the data, one, to identify people who are likely to get it, but secondly, to get them to understand like I just used in that story, the concept that I'm trying to drive you to, or that I would like you to at least share with me. I'm trying to share with you this idea. How do I do that? And it's always, I mean, as human beings, we're driven by stories. That's how we've always passed on information to each other. And so it's now so the problem was, look, it's like we check the box, male or female, and we poll and we say, oh, men think this, women think that. It's not. Data is part of our real world now. And it's like I said, it's not. I think what we're going to find out is more variations than male female, and I don't mean sexual orientation or anything like that, but I just mean like it's once you have 300 million cases a day on something, it may not be, gender may not have anything to do with the differences of why people are seeing something different, and then how do you tackle that within your company or within the country right now? So I don't know if I'm making sense, but
no, it does make sense, and it's really interesting. We have a question from Twitter from Frank Scavo, who is one of the top enterprise software technology analysts in the world, actually. And Frank asks, has the data-driven campaign approach reached its peak, or is there more ground to gain in the coming years?
I don't think at all that it's reached its peak. I personally think we're in these infancy stages of this. We're like 2-year-old toddlers walking around, and that there's just tremendous, leaps and bounds are going to be made over the next 2, 3, 4 election cycles. The problem is trying to predict how or what it will be. It's like if at the end of the Dean campaign I had predicted YouTube, I wouldn't have, or that mobile would be once the iPhone launched, that would change. But I think that data and what we're going to do, and some of it's kind of could get scary. It's not all utopia. I think there's a lot of predictive data analysis that's going on in politics that is going to be interesting to see how we as a society deal with it, and I think the companies will be doing it as well. But how do we deal with that? What happens when you can literally predict human behavior? And we're getting close to that. I mean, in the Obama campaign, they were able, and actually even in the Dean campaign, we were able to predict that if a certain targets received our message, and it cost us $2 to get the message there, or to acquire their attention, that there was a 87% chance they'd give us $57, and you know what? They did, and the Obama campaign was able to take that much further. and I still think we're just scratching the surface. The data is only going to get finer. There's going to be more data on each of us, and again, that's what I'm saying. There's no such the whole privacy and other things. It's not all going to be upside, but I think that there's a lot of room to grow.
And Frank has a follow-up question, but give us a short answer to this one, because there's a lot more that we want to talk about regarding this storytelling. He says, we know that Republicans were beat hard with data-driven campaigning in 2012. Are they catching up?
Yes and no. They're catching up, but they're still woefully behind. And it's kind of like first mover in anything. The advantage that the Democrats have is just so big that I don't see them catching up anytime soon. You never say never, but I don't see that, and certainly not catching up by 2016.
Okay, so your firm, which is called Trippi Associates,
right?
You talk about building movements, creating movements. And I think many of us who are watching movements of any type on television, we see a spontaneous arising. And yet, when you talk about building a movement, creating a grassroots movement, that implies that it's not just a spontaneous arising of emotion and fervor that's creating instantaneously happening and creating change. So how do you create a movement?
Well, it's the people are already there. It's kind of like they were already. Again, they may not be active. They don't know that there are other people who think like them, feel like them, and it's the knowledge that there are other people that feel like them, that I'm not in this all alone, that I can join with other people and promote the issue I care about, or the candidate I care about, or the brand I care about. That's that's what you're creating. You're creating the knowledge. You're making them aware that they're not alone, that we are. And by the way, I think this is one of the big problems with getting to the other question about a second ago about the Republicans. One of the things I've come to become convinced of is ideologically they're opposed to we're all in this together. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons Democrats or progressives are better at building brand movements or any other, or our political movement in the campaign, is because we believe we're all in this together. They're rugged individualists, and so it's harder for them to even write a narrative, the language of a narrative that says we're all in this together. And I don't mean, by the way, some left ideas. I'm talking about we're all in this brand together. They don't think that way. And so it makes it tougher for them to compete. But in the end, what's going on is there are, let's take the country, there's over 300 million Americans. If you said today, how many of you would I'm trying to think of something that's not ideological, but how many of you would want to go to a baseball game together tonight? How many Americans would raise their hand? Many. They don't know. In other words, you could start to create something pretty amazing about everybody going to the game next Saturday once everybody realizes that there are people who are going to go. My friends are all going because now we're all on social media. I can see that you're going, that I'm going, that Craig Newmark's going, and now that starts to broaden out. More people who know Craig decide they're going too. Some people who know me less people who know me are going to do it, because if I'm going, they're not going. But my point is that you can start to see how it's that information. It's the information that, and the narrative. So we're telling the story, we're all going to go to this game, and then you're starting to get information later on top of that about who's going. Some people are going because the person they've been dying to ask out, they just found out is going to the game, right? I mean, there's different reasons we all have, but we're all, there's a way to create this around a brand or even an event or a political campaign. But it all involves using the data and the story and the ability to have data help you tell that story to people who want to hear that particular story. And now you're starting to get a much bigger, more people at that event, or more people joining the cause, or more people buying that brand than would have if you used traditional methods of just buying TV ads, or which is part of this is everybody's so stuck on the old paradigm, and I hate using that word either, but the same, stuck on the old methods of how you advertise. The old like I said, the old advertising just wants to know why people do things and try to convince them, to do more of it. Data actually makes it a much deeper connection.
So for brands who want to engage with a community, it seems like there's two dimensions to this based on what you're saying. Number one is be aware of the data so that you understand their actions and their behaviors. And that's a set of technical skills to a certain extent. But then don't you have to, in order to drive a community though, don't you have to have some understanding or some sense of that community's shared goals and shared interests? And that seems to me the trickier part. So how do you do that? How do you please go ahead.
No, I mean, if you're trying to get people to it's two things. The most important thing right now is to be authentic, and you have to be authentic in your communications. You got to be authentic in your storytelling. But the second most important thing is to realize that if you don't empower people to make your brand better, in other words, or to make the event better, or to make your party better, or to give you, or to use their ideas, to listen, then it's never going to happen. I mean, if you're trying to build a community. So the two things are to stop doing the kind of like phony corporate ad speak and be real, and be authentic. And the second thing is, you don't assume you're the only one with the power to communicate anymore. The power to communicate, the most powerful communicators for your brand are your consumers, are the people who use your brand or your products. They're much more powerful. Look, even in the Obama campaign, the Obama campaign sending out an email saying, hey, watch Barack's speech, it's amazing, is not as important as you receiving an email from a friend with a link saying, man, I just saw this guy, you got to watch his speech, he's amazing. That's much more powerful. We don't trust corporate leaders anymore, political leaders, journalists. We don't trust them. We trust our friends, our coworkers, and our family, and people we know. And so those people are much more powerful in telling your brand story than you are. They're much more credible in telling your brand story than you are. So now the question is, why would Joe tell a story to his friends about your brand? Well, there's different things. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you could encourage that, but a lot of it is empowering them to do it and trusting them, trusting your users, your consumers, and that's what a lot of them want to trust. It's the same thing that happened in the Dean campaign. The establishment in the Democratic Party didn't trust average people out there, decentralized, to carry a message. And Obama did. The Clinton campaign didn't. And in the end, that's in the end the big difference between those two campaigns. He empowered people, and we'll see who learned that lesson this time around. But companies need to learn some of these. I think would benefit from learning some of these lessons as well.
So then what you're saying is the foundation of community, aside from being authentic, is to genuinely seek to empower the members of those communities into some shared experience that's important to and valuable to them.
Right, exactly. And if you're not offering that, then you're not going to get. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't improve your brand or something, but you're not going to get them to help you do it. I mean, why? They have no, they have nothing there's no reason for them to. So it's being creative about thinking that way. I think that matters quite a bit. And I do think, I think, we see it all the time. You'll see some companies that are really, really good at sort of empowering their consumers, and others that just are still light years away. And by the way, it's in politics too. I mean, we can slip back before we find the next leap in how data will be used in politics.
Do you have advice? It's funny. I was going to say, do you have advice on how to empower people? And then I halted because I thought, well, isn't that kind of obvious? But actually, it's not obvious at all, because if you think about brands, or you think about politicians and people who want to motivate and encourage others to create a community to come together, they're not. Most of the time, they're not thinking about the members of that community. They're thinking about themselves. How can I benefit about?
Right. That is exactly right. I mean, if you're in that thinking about how do I benefit from this, then you're not consumer focused, right? You're not really a consumer. It should be, how can my consumers benefit from this, from my product? And obviously companies think that way, but I'm just saying, if the way you communicate is, I'm about to communicate, how am I going to benefit from this? If that's the way you're thinking, which was really the one-way broadcast TV way of thinking. I mean, the box, there was no way for anybody to communicate back to you, so it was all this one-way command and control. And I think breaking out of that, I mean, technology, social media, all that is empowering people to tell your story. It's not, how am I going to benefit from this? It's going to, how do I get others to tell my story, to tell the concept that I talked to you about with the second machine age. How do I use the data and the tools out there to get others to tell that story for me? Because I can only reach so many people, and if I go on TV to tell it, no one's gonna. It's all of a sudden it's the top telling people what they should believe again. They're not coming to it on their own. I think that's a very powerful concept for corporate communication teams and corporate C-level people to start to get a better idea of.
But how does somebody who is fully steeped in command and control culture, which frankly is most people in business that I talk to at a senior level, how can those people, how can they learn, or how can they communicate or present, here's how you're going to benefit, when that's not really in their consciousness?
Well, that's part of the reason you're seeing people. Well, I mean, the first answer to that is, look, we used to, when I was growing up, it used to be go out and find yourself a 50-year-old mentor who knows everything about the business you want to get into, and hope he'll coach you and help you develop a career. We're now, it's flipped. You need to go out. A lot of these companies should go out and find a bunch of 22 and 23-year-old mentors to explain to help the company understand better how to communicate in the world as it exists today, because they're all steeped in the old thinking. That's one. The second thing I think is that what's part of this is also why so many. I'll give you an example. Every newspaper in this country, explain to me why, the day Craig Newmark started Craigslist, it had the LA Times or the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of the old thinkers about what a newspaper was had thought, hey, we should launch Craigslist at the LA Times. They would own classified advertising today as it exists. They didn't do that. Why? Because they don't think that way. It's not just the story of how to build your brand, but if you're blind to all that we're talking about, and there are a lot of companies that are going out of business right now, or will be very shortly, because they do not see this disruptive change that's coming. It's not just in how you communicate. You could literally, I mean, look, Kodak, 187,000 employees the day it went bankrupt. Instagram it sells itself to Facebook, has 13 employees, I think it was. So did Kodak not see that coming? And how many other companies right now are not just not understanding why they need to rethink the way they communicate, but even take a real look at their business model, the revenue, where they're going. TV networks today that are sitting on a cable box, really going to be fascinating. Do they just sit there while while Netflix and everything else, this disruption continues to change the way we communicate, the way we consume media? We already have an entire group of people, young people, who don't get their information by reading newspapers or by watching the evening news. This is what I'm saying. It's about really using the data, understand not just the narrative in terms of what's happening in communication, what your business does, but using the data right now, really looking at the data to see where are people moving to. And if they're moving off of cable to other, a la carte services, why? And you decide you're gonna no, I'm just gonna stay on cable. I'm gonna stay on cable without using that data to give yourself a shot at where things are moving. How can I move my brand there? You're gonna be a dinosaur. You're gonna be Kodak. And so I think this has much broader implications than just, I mean, I think this is really important to talk about the communication, how we create a movement in the narrative, but I think it's got a lot, those ramifications. There's a movement going on right now. People are moving away from broadcast and cable. That movement is happening. Where are you in that movement? I'm using that one industry as an example. Otherwise, there's going to be more Kodaks in that industry, and we're literally watching it.
So I think with many corporations, they tend to focus on the activity of communication as a substitute for the activity of rethinking what they're doing from the perspective of what does the constituency actually want and what is best for the consumers, as opposed to how do we use communicate as opposed to using communication in order to create a larger pot of gold strictly for ourselves.
Right, exactly. And so that's part of the problem. And once you're locked into that sort of way of thinking, it's very, very hard to get out of it. And then all of a sudden you wake up one day and you realize, you know, we're in deep trouble. We're going to go out of, we've totally misread the situation. And we're seeing that, not, like I said, not just in communication, but it's all tied together now. It's all, you know, it's not, if you aren't rethinking the way you're communicating, then you're not rethinking what you're doing in terms of putting it, that the consumers are becoming much more empowered. Voters are much more empowered. The average person has so much more power and information at their disposal right now than they did 10 years ago or 20. I mean, depending on what, you know, you're at C-level in a major corporation, then and you're sort of still in the top-down command and control mode. That'll work for a while. And by the way, that's the other thing. They're all trapped in their success. If your company's making billions of dollars right now, doing it the old way, I mean, if you know, if you're a cable company that's making a ton of money, that may be fine, and it may work for a while. But so you're still making a ton of money, so you don't change, you don't rethink anything. And yeah, the world's changing. I just got to communicate differently.
Right, exactly.
You know, that could, yeah. But then that's how you sort of are asleep at the switch, and the next thing you know, Netflix is, or somebody, you know, that's what I'm saying. I don't know. The hardest part is predicting, which is why you got to be data driven and really listening to that narrative. There's a narrative out there. That people are trying to tell you something. And if you're not, you know, building and listening to that narrative, building your own, you're going to be, I think, find yourself in a lot of trouble. I once, right after the Dean campaign, I went to the Mexican Newspaper Publishers Association, asked me to come down and give them a talk about how this internet was changing things and what they should know. And I, at the end of my whole talk about how disruptive this was going to be and how people would have more power, they literally said I was like crazy, that there was only, like, at the time, I think like 11% internet penetration in Mexico, that I didn't know what I was talking about. There was no way that it was, you know, what I was saying was going to happen. And I just said, do you have any idea what the LA Times, the New York Times, Boston Globe, Washington Post, and every newspaper in America would do if they could go back to the days when there was 11% internet penetration in the United States, knowing what they know now? That they would have seen it. They would have seen this world we were in. There would be a Craigslist, but it would be probably owned by the Newspaper Association or started by them. But that's the whole thing. We're in a very disruptive, and it gets back to my original story about the second machine age. If computing capacity is going to double in the next 2 years, cut in half in price, form factors are going to be smaller. You know, your devices, if you're an accounting firm right now, these devices are going to be able to tell the story of the second you made an expenditure, the device is going to know that was a write-off or not, and who it was, and where it goes into the accounting software. And a lot of accountants are going to be, you know, are going to go by, and firms are going to be in deep trouble, not because of another company, but because of technology. And if you're not listening to this or building your own brand identity with people, you're just going to get sideswiped by it. I think it's going to happen very quickly.
Okay, Joe, we're unfortunately just about out of time. Why don't we finish out by, if you don't mind, share your advice to corporate executives, communicators, execs of all types, who are so interested in engaging with their communities and creating communities of interest around their companies, and they're having trouble getting people to like them on Twitter, let alone actually create meaningful engagement. What's your advice to these people? What should they do?
Well, I mean, the first thing is, you know, to be liked or followed on Twitter is not like it's nice, but it's not. That isn't should not be the end game. Is like how many Twitter followers can I get, or how many likes can I get on Facebook? There has to be a meaningful connection, something of benefit to the consumer, the voter, the citizen, and the key is to, again, I'd go back to being authentic in your communication, and to have some connection and empowerment to your consumer to help you carry the messaging. That the old company being able to say, put out a press release and get people to buy into what you're saying is gone. It's to recognize that the real power of communicating about your company comes from the people who use your company's product or services. And you have to empower those people to tell your story. Now, I really think that this isn't that hard, but it does take a change in mindset and and probably some people who aren't grounded in just the same old way of communicating. You know, whether they be data scientists, or I call them data poets. It's not just looking at data as numbers, but even being able to look at the data and give voice to it, and use it to create a narrative about who you are and what you want people to get. And I think that's really important.
So this is really the key thing: is understanding, is adopting the mindset of what matters and how do you empower your constituency. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. If you could do that, the rest will follow.
Okay. Well, we have been talking with Joe Trippi, who really pioneered the use of data in political campaigns. And Joe has been sharing his lessons both for politics and, very importantly, for corporate engagement on episode number 107 of CXOTalk. Joe, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it, Michael.
And I hope you'll come back another time.
I sure will.
And to my friendly and glorious co-host, Vala Afshar, wherever you are, I hope you come back next week. And I hope all of you in the audience especially come back next week. Have a good week, everybody. Bye-bye.